My boss told me I'd never become anything. Years later, he called me asking for help like nothing happened. But this time, I wasn't the same person anymore. I was standing at my desk, staring at a spreadsheet that had stopped making sense halfway through. Numbers blurred together, like my brain just refused to keep up anymore. Behind me, I could feel it, that quiet shift in the office. The kind where people pretend they're not listening, but they are. That was the kind of place it was. I was 23, fresh out of college, still carrying that belief that hard work actually meant something. This was my first real job, an entry-level analyst role at a logistics company outside Columbus. Nothing impressive, but to me, it felt like a start, like something I could build on. I didn't realize yet that some places aren't built for that. My boss, Richard Hale, had this way of making you feel small without ever raising his voice. Late 40s, always calm, always controlled. But every word from him felt like it carried weight you couldn't shake off. With me, it didn't take long. At first, it was just small comments. I'd turn in work, and instead of feedback, he'd ask something like, "Did you think this through?" No explanation, no guidance, just doubt, placed right in front of me like it belonged there. I told myself it was normal, that I was new, that I just had to learn. So I stayed late. Every night. I double-checked everything, then checked it again until I started second-guessing even the things I knew were right. I stopped speaking up in meetings after getting ignored one too many times. You learn fast in places like that. You learn where you stand. And I stood somewhere near invisible. There was a guy named Mark who sat across from me. One night, we were both still there late, the office almost empty. He looked over, saw me fixing the same report again, and just shook his head. He said it didn't matter how many times I fixed things. If the boss decided I was the guy who messed up, that's what I was. I brushed it off. But the truth is, it stuck. Because deep down, I was starting to feel it too. Like no matter what I did, I was already labeled, already written off before I had a chance to prove anything. And that kind of feeling doesn't hit all at once. It builds, slowly, until one day, something small happens, and suddenly, it isn't small anymore. The mistake didn't feel like a big deal at first. It was just a data entry issue. A small discrepancy in a weekly report, one number off that ended up affecting a projection. Nothing catastrophic. The kind of thing that, in a normal place, gets corrected, maybe talked through, and then you move on. But that wasn't how things worked there. I didn't even realize something was wrong until Richard called me into his office. He didn't sound angry. That would have been easier to deal with. Instead, his voice was flat, controlled, like he was already bored of the situation before it even started. I remember walking in, closing the door behind me, and immediately feeling that pressure in my chest. Like I already knew how this was going to go. He had the report pulled up on his screen. Didn't look at me right away. Just scrolled through it slowly, like he was giving me time to feel uncomfortable. Then he pointed at the number. Didn't raise his voice. Didn't even sigh. He just asked how something like that happens. I started explaining. Tried to walk him through it. Told him I'd fix it, that I'd already started correcting the data. My voice sounded steady, but inside, I could feel it. That familiar panic creeping in. Not because of the mistake. Because I knew this wasn't just about the mistake. He let me talk for a few seconds, then cut me off. Not aggressively. Just enough to remind me I wasn't really being heard. Then he leaned back in his chair, finally looked at me, and said something that didn't sound loud. But it landed heavier than anything else. You're not going to become anything meaningful. That was it. No lecture. No follow-up. No explanation. Just that. For a second, I thought I misheard him. Like my brain was trying to protect me from what he actually said. But the way he looked at me, calm, certain, it made it clear. He meant it. And the worst part? There was no reaction from him after. No tension. No anger. He just turned back to his screen like the conversation was already over. Like what he said was obvious. Like it didn't even need to be discussed. I didn't argue. Didn't defend myself. I just stood there for a second longer than I should have, nodded slightly, and walked out of the office. Back to my desk. Back to that same spreadsheet. But nothing looked the same anymore. I could feel people glancing at me, trying not to be obvious about it. Mark didn't say anything this time. Just kept working like he already knew. And maybe he did. I sat there, staring at my screen, but I wasn't seeing numbers anymore. Just that sentence. Over and over. You're not going to become anything. And the thing that bothered me most wasn't even him saying it. It was how easily it started to sound believable. For a while, I didn't tell anyone what he said. Not Mark. Not my friends. Not even myself, if I'm being honest. I just carried it. Like something small and sharp sitting in the back of my mind, poking at me every time I made the slightest mistake. And once that thought gets in, it changes how you see everything. Every email I sent, I reread 5 times. Every task I finished, I assumed was wrong before anyone even checked it. I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way Richard would skip over me in meetings, like I wasn't even part of the room. The way my ideas, when I actually managed to say something, would get ignored, then repeated by someone else 10 minutes later and suddenly sound useful. At first, I told myself it was just bad luck. Then I started thinking maybe it was me. Maybe he saw something I didn't. That's the dangerous part. When someone says something like that with enough confidence, it doesn't just sit there. It starts to grow. I began shrinking without even realizing it. I stopped asking questions. Stopped volunteering for anything new. I'd come in, do exactly what was assigned, and leave as soon as I could. Not because I didn't care anymore, but because I was starting to believe there was no point in trying harder. If I was already seen as someone who wouldn't become anything, then what exactly was I working toward? One night, I stayed late again. Not because I needed to, just because going home felt worse somehow. The office was quiet, lights dimmed, that low hum of machines filling the space. Mark was there too, same as before. He glanced over at me after a while, like he'd been thinking about something. Then he said something that caught me off guard. He asked what Richard had said to me that day. I froze for a second. Didn't answer right away. Part of me didn't want to say it out loud, like that would somehow make it more real. But eventually, I told him. Just that one sentence. Nothing else. He didn't look surprised. That was the first thing I noticed. He just leaned back in his chair, exhaled slowly, and nodded like it confirmed something he already knew. Then he said Richard used to say things like that to other people too. Not everyone. Just the ones he decided weren't worth investing in. That hit differently. Because suddenly, it wasn't just about me failing. It was about being written off. Decided on. Before I even had a real chance. I asked him why no one said anything. Why people just let it happen. He gave a small shrug, like the answer was obvious. Because arguing doesn't change anything. Because people need their jobs. Because it's easier to stay quiet than to fight something you probably won't win. I sat there, letting that sink in. And for the first time, I felt something shift. Not confidence. Not motivation. Just clarity. Because if nothing I did in that place was going to change how I was seen, then maybe the problem wasn't me. But that thought came with something else too. A question I hadn't been ready to ask before. If this place wasn't going to let me grow, then why was I still there? I didn't quit right away. That would have been too clean. Too simple. Instead, I stayed. Not because I believed in the job anymore, but because I didn't know what came next. That's the part people don't really talk about. The space between realizing something is wrong and actually having the courage to leave it. So I kept showing up. Same desk. Same gray carpet. Same quiet tension in the air. But something in me had changed. I stopped trying to impress Richard. Stopped chasing approval that was never going to come. I did my work, but I didn't overdo it anymore. No more staying late just to prove I cared. No more reworking things 5 times just to avoid criticism that would come anyway. And weirdly, that's when things got worse. Not in a loud way. In a quieter, more deliberate way. I started getting less work. Not less responsibility, just fewer opportunities. Projects I used to be included in suddenly went to someone else. Meetings I had been part of before. I wasn't invited anymore. It was like I was slowly being erased. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. But then it became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, I walked past the conference room and saw a team discussion happening. One I knew I should have been part of. My name was literally on the project. But there they were, going over everything without me. Richard was leading it. Didn't even glance at me when I walked by. That's when it really clicked. This wasn't about helping me improve. This was about pushing me out. Just slowly enough that it wouldn't look obvious. That night, I sat in my car longer than usual. Engine off. Hands on the wheel. Just staring at the building like I was trying to figure out how I ended up there in the first place. And for the first time, I stopped asking what I did wrong. I started asking something else. What would happen if I left? The thought felt unfamiliar. Not exciting. Not yet. Just uncertain. Because leaving meant starting over. It meant risking being wrong about everything. About myself. About my potential. About whether I could actually do more somewhere else. And part of me was still stuck on his words. You're not going to become anything. That sentence had settled deep. Even now, it lingered, like a warning. Like if I left and failed somewhere else, it would prove he was right all along. I sat there, going back and forth in my head, replaying everything, every mistake, every comment, every moment I felt smaller than I used to be. Then something simple hit me. Staying wasn't proving him wrong. It was proving him right. Because if I stayed in a place that had already decided what I was worth, then I was accepting it too. That thought didn't fix everything, but it was enough. Enough to make a decision I'd been avoiding. The next morning, I walked into that office knowing something had changed. Not on the outside. Everything looked the same. But inside, I was already leaving. The only thing left was figuring out how. And that turned out to be harder than I expected. Because the moment I started looking for a way out, something happened that made me question everything all over again. It started with something small. An email. Nothing dramatic. Just a short message from a department I'd barely interacted with before. They were asking for help with a data issue. Apparently, someone had recommended me. At first, I thought it was a mistake. People didn't usually recommend me for anything in that office. Not out loud, at least. I almost ignored it. But something about it stuck with me. Maybe it was the timing. Maybe it was the fact that, for once, someone outside my immediate team saw me as useful. So I replied. Kept it simple. Said I'd take a look. The issue itself wasn't complicated. Just messy data, inconsistent inputs, a few broken formulas that no one had bothered to fix properly. The kind of thing I had quietly gotten good at over the past year. I spent a couple hours on it. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to see if I still could. If I still had that part of me that actually cared about solving something. And I did. By the end of the day, I had cleaned it up, rebuilt the structure, and sent it back with a short explanation. No overthinking. No second guessing. Just done. I didn't expect anything from it. But the next morning, I got another email. Then another. Different people this time. Similar requests. It caught me off guard. Slowly, without me even realizing it, I started getting pulled into things outside my team. Small tasks at first, then slightly bigger ones. Nothing official. No title change. No recognition from Richard. But people were coming to me. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something I hadn't felt in that office before. Not confidence. Not fully. But something close. Like maybe I wasn't as incapable as I'd started to believe. Of course, it didn't take long for Richard to notice. He didn't bring it up directly. That wasn't his style. Instead, he called me into his office again. Same setup as before. Same quiet tone. He asked why I was spending time on things outside my assigned work. I told him the truth. That other departments had reached out. That I was helping where I could. He listened, nodded slightly, then said something that, on the surface, sounded reasonable. He said I should focus on my own responsibilities. That spreading myself too thin wouldn't help anyone. But there was something underneath it. Something controlled. Like he didn't like where this was going. I left that office with that same familiar weight in my chest. But this time, it felt different. Because for the first time, I had something to compare it to. On one side, there was him, still seeing me as someone who wouldn't become anything. On the other, there were people who didn't know me yet, but were choosing to trust me anyway. That contrast stayed with me, and it started to shift something deeper. Not just how I saw the job, but how I saw myself. Still, I kept it quiet. Did my work. Helped where I could. Didn't make it obvious. But the more I did, the more things started to change. Not in a good way. Because a few weeks later, something happened that made it clear. Richard wasn't just watching anymore. He was already making a move. And this time, it wasn't subtle. It happened on a Monday morning. No warning. No build-up. Just a calendar invite. Subject line was vague. Something like performance review follow-up. That alone told me enough. Those kinds of meetings never meant anything good, especially not in that place. I walked into the conference room, and right away, something felt off. It wasn't just Richard this time. HR was there too. That was new. That was not small. I sat down across from them, trying to keep my face neutral, but I could feel it, that tightness in my chest again, creeping back like it never really left. Richard started talking first. Same tone as always. Calm. Measured. Like he was explaining something obvious. He said there had been concerns about my performance. That there were ongoing inconsistencies. That my focus had been misaligned with team priorities. It all sounded official. Carefully worded. But none of it was specific. That's what stood out to me. No clear examples. No actual discussion about my work. Just broad statements that were impossible to argue against without sounding defensive. Then HR spoke. She mentioned documentation. Said there had been a pattern. That word, pattern, stuck with me. Because I knew what that meant. It meant this wasn't spontaneous. This had been building. On paper. Quietly. I asked for details. Tried to stay calm about it. Richard finally pulled up a few examples. And that's when I saw it. Reports from months ago. Minor mistakes. Things I had already corrected. Situations that had never even been brought up to me at the time. All collected. Framed like evidence. Like proof of something bigger. It hit me all at once. This wasn't about helping me improve. This was about justifying something that had already been decided. Then came the part that made everything clear. They said I was being placed on a performance plan. Not fired. Not yet. But close enough. A few weeks to improve. A list of expectations that were vague enough to shift at any moment. Check-ins that felt less like support and more like surveillance. I sat there, listening, nodding when I needed to. But inside, something had already settled. Because I understood what this was. It wasn't a second chance. It was an exit plan. For me. And strangely, I didn't feel panic. Not the way I expected. I felt calm. Not because things were okay. But because, for the first time, everything made sense. The way I'd been treated. The way opportunities disappeared. The way I was slowly pushed to the side. It all led here. And suddenly, that sentence from before, "You're not going to become anything," it didn't feel like a prediction anymore. It felt like a decision he had made. A long time ago, I walked out of that room knowing one thing for sure. I wasn't going to fight to stay. Not in a place that had already made up its mind about me. But I also knew something else. I couldn't leave empty-handed. Not this time. Because if I walked away now, without something lined up, there was a part of me, quiet, but still there, that would always wonder if maybe he was right. And I wasn't willing to carry that question any longer. So that night, for the first time since I started that job, I went home and opened my laptop. Not to fix mistakes. Not to double-check reports. But to start looking for a way out. And what I found wasn't what I expected at all. At first, it felt like I was starting from zero again. Sitting at my kitchen table, laptop open, scrolling through job listings that all seemed to blur together. Same titles. Same descriptions. Same vague promises about growth and opportunity. And in the back of my mind, that voice. Not even Richard's anymore. Mine. Quiet, but persistent. What if he's right? I hated that thought. But it was there. Every time I hovered over the apply button, it crept in. Every time I looked at job requirements that seemed just slightly out of reach, it got louder. For a couple of days, I didn't send anything. Just looked. Compared. Closed the laptop. Opened it again. It wasn't fear of rejection. It was fear of confirmation. Because rejection would just be proof of something I was already starting to believe. But then something unexpected happened. I got another email. Not from my team. Not from HR. From someone I barely knew. One of the managers from another department I had helped a few weeks earlier. He kept it simple. Said he appreciated the work I did. Said I handled things better than most people he'd worked with. Then he added something I wasn't expecting. He asked if I had ever considered moving into a more technical role. I just stared at the screen for a while. Because no one had ever asked me that before. Not in that company. Not anywhere. To them, I was the guy who made mistakes. But to him, I was something else. That email didn't change everything. But it cracked something open. Enough for me to start applying. Not everywhere. Just a few places. Roles that felt like a stretch, but not impossible. And for the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about proving Richard wrong. I was thinking about what I could actually become somewhere else. The first couple applications went nowhere. No responses. No feedback. Just silence. And I felt it. That old doubt trying to crawl back in. But then, one response came through. Then another. Nothing big yet. Just initial screenings. Sure calls. But even that felt different. Because the questions they asked weren't about what I did wrong. They were about how I solved problems. How I thought. How I approached things. And I realized something during those calls. I wasn't struggling to answer. I wasn't fumbling. I actually knew what I was talking about. That realization hit harder than anything else. Because for so long, I had been adjusting myself to fit into a place that never saw my value. Now, outside of it, I sounded like someone who actually knew what he was doing. Still, I kept everything quiet. At work, nothing changed on the surface. I showed up, did what was required, sat through those pointless check-ins where they tracked my progress like I was already halfway out the door. Richard barely looked at me anymore. And I preferred it that way, because by then, I was already somewhere else in my head. Not stuck, not shrinking, just waiting for something real. And then one evening, just as I was about to close my laptop, an email came in that made everything stop. Not a rejection, not a screening, something else, something I wasn't ready for. Because it wasn't just an opportunity, it was a way out. And it came from a place I never expected. The email came in late, almost 9 at night, when I was already halfway out of that headspace, ready to shut everything down and try again the next day. I remember staring at the notification for a second before opening it, like I didn't want to get my hopes up for nothing. But this one felt different right away. It wasn't automated. It wasn't generic. It was from a smaller company, one I had applied to almost without thinking. I barely remembered the application itself, but they remembered me. They mentioned specifics, things I had said in my resume, the way I described solving problems. Even one of the projects I'd helped with at my current job, the kind of thing Richard never cared about. They wanted to skip the usual steps, go straight to a final interview. I read it twice just to be sure I wasn't misunderstanding something. Then a third time, because nothing like that had ever happened to me before. The interview was set for later that week. And for the first time in a long time, I felt nervous in a different way. Not the kind that comes from fear, the kind that comes from possibility. I spent the next few days preparing, not obsessively, not like before, just enough to feel ready. I didn't overthink every answer. I didn't try to sound perfect. I just focused on being clear, on being honest, on showing what I actually knew. The day of the interview, I took it from my car during lunch break. Didn't want to risk anyone overhearing. Didn't want anything from that office bleeding into this. It was a video call. 2 people on the other side. No stiff introductions. No cold tone. Just normal conversation. They asked about my experience, but not in a way that felt like they were trying to catch mistakes. They asked how I approached problems, how I handled messy data, how I figured things out when there wasn't a clear answer. And I answered, without freezing, without second-guessing every word. At one point, one of them nodded and said something that stuck with me. He said they needed someone who could think, not just follow instructions. That line hit harder than I expected, because in that moment, I realized just how long I had been in a place where thinking wasn't valued, where initiative wasn't rewarded, where I had slowly been trained to stay quiet instead of step up. The call lasted longer than scheduled. That felt like a good sign, but I didn't let myself read too much into it. I had learned not to. Still, when it ended, I sat there for a minute, just staring at the blank screen. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to certainty. Not that I'd get the job, but that I was capable of more than I'd been told. The next couple of days dragged. Work felt even more distant than before. The performance plan check-ins felt pointless. Richard's voice sounded like background noise, because my focus wasn't there anymore. It was on that email, that interview, that possibility. Then, on Friday afternoon, just as I was about to leave, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost didn't pick up, but something told me to. So I did. And the moment I heard the voice on the other end, I knew everything was about to change, but not in the way I expected. The voice on the other end was calm, confident, and for a second, I didn't even process what he was saying. He introduced himself, mentioned the company, thanked me for taking the time to interview. My brain lagged behind his words, trying to catch up, trying not to jump to conclusions too early. Then he said it. They wanted to offer me the position. Just like that. No drawn-out explanation. No hesitation. Just a clear decision. I remember gripping my phone a little tighter, like I needed something physical to stay grounded. Because part of me was still waiting for the catch. For the but. For something that would pull it back. It didn't come. Instead, he started going over details. The role. The responsibilities. The team. Then the part that really hit. The salary. It was more than I was making. A lot more. For a second, I just sat there in silence, listening, but not really hearing anything after that. Because everything in my head had already shifted. All those late nights. All those moments of doubt. All the times I questioned whether I was the problem. And now this. I managed to respond. Kept my voice steady. Told him I appreciated the opportunity. Asked a couple of questions just to make sure I wasn't rushing into anything blindly. But deep down, I already knew. I was leaving. When the call ended, I didn't move right away. I just sat there in my car, staring through the windshield at the same building I had been walking into every day. And for the first time, it didn't feel heavy. It didn't feel like something I had to push myself into. It just felt temporary, like something I had already outgrown. I didn't tell anyone that day. Not at work. Not even Mark. I just went home, sat on my couch, and let it sink in. Because this wasn't just a new job. This was proof. Proof that everything I had started to believe about myself wasn't true. At least, not in the way I had been told. The next week, I handed in my notice. Richard barely reacted. He looked at the letter, nodded once, and said something about it being my decision. No questions. No attempt to keep me. Nothing. And somehow, that told me everything I needed to know. I worked out the rest of my time quietly. Finished what I needed to finish. Didn't look back. And when my last day came, I walked out of that building without saying anything extra. No speech. No closure. Just done. I didn't need him to see what came next. I didn't need him to understand. Because whatever happened after that, it wasn't for him. And for a while, I thought that was the end of it. I thought I had left that part of my life behind for good. But I was wrong. Because years later, out of nowhere, my phone rang again. And this time, I recognized the voice immediately. I hadn't heard his voice in years. But I knew it right away. Some voices just stay with you like that. Not because you want them to, but because of what they were tied to. I was sitting in my office when the call came in. Different place, different life. Bigger team. My own desk, not some corner where people forgot I existed. By then, I wasn't just getting by, I was leading projects. People actually came to me for decisions. Funny how things change. I almost didn't answer. Unknown number. But something told me to pick up. And then I heard it. Richard. He sounded different. Still controlled, still measured, but there was something missing. That edge. That quiet certainty he used to have. For a second, neither of us said much. Then he started talking. Said he had been trying to track me down. That he heard I was doing well. That I had moved up faster than expected. I didn't ask how he knew. Didn't really care. He got to the point after that. Said he was working somewhere new now. Smaller company. Different environment. He mentioned they were having some challenges. Systems not working the way they should. Data issues piling up. Things falling behind. And then came the part one thing he had been building toward the whole time. He said they could use someone like me. Not in those exact words. But close enough. He didn't apologize. Didn't bring up what he had said back then. Just acted like we were two professionals having a normal conversation. Like none of it had ever happened. I leaned back in my chair, listening. Not interrupting. Letting him talk. And the whole time, I felt something I didn't expect. Not anger. Not even satisfaction. Just distance. Like I was listening to a story that didn't belong to me anymore. When he finally paused, it felt like he was waiting. Waiting for me to say yes. Or at least consider it. And I thought about it. Not seriously. But just enough to understand the moment. Years ago, I would have jumped at this. Would have seen it as validation. As a chance to prove something. To finally hear him say I was wrong about you. But sitting there now, I didn't need that anymore. Because I had already built something. Without him. Without that place. Without those words defining me. So when I spoke, I kept it simple. I told him I couldn't help. Didn't over-explain. Didn't remind him of what he said. Didn't need to. There was a pause on the other end. Longer this time. Then he gave a short response. Something polite. Something neutral. And that was it. The call ended. No closure. No apology. Nothing dramatic. Just silence. I set my phone down and sat there for a minute. Thinking about how strange it was that something that once felt so heavy could end so quietly. Because the truth is, I didn't need revenge. I didn't need him to admit anything. Walking away was enough. And choosing not to go back, that was everything.